Welcome to the wonderful world of solvency. Solvency is one of the 4 stock issues and one of the 4 burdens of proof that must be proved by the affirmative team. We define solvency as the ability for the proposed affirmative plan to solve the harms identified in the first affirmative constructive. So, if the affirmative team claims in their inherency and harms argument that the PRISM software violates the Constitution, decreases our safety, and violates our civil liberties, the proposed affirmative plan must solve for all 3 of these harms. And the ability to solve these harms is called solvency. A plan that cannot solve these harms has no solvency, and a plan that fully solves these harms has solvency. But what if the plan only solves some of the harms? It's possible to have some solvency, such as solving for 2 of the 3 harms. But this creates what we call a solvency deficit, or a gap, between the problems identified by the affirmative team and the ability for the proposed plan to solve the problem. If a solvency deficit occurs, affirmative teams might try to claim that the status quo has a complete solvency deficit because it does nothing to solve the problem, and that the affirmative plan closes that deficit significantly, even if solvency is 100%. So it's still better than the status quo, which is 0%. But a good negative team will argue that it isn't acceptable for the affirmative team to present harms that their plan can't solve. In other words, one of the 2 things is true. Either the affirmative team overhyped their harms to meet that burden, or they overhyped their solvency to meet that burden. So a solvency deficit means either the affirmative team fails to prove harms or solvency. You may recall from the video on harms that we talked about not trying to pack every possible harm into the first affirmative constructive, and instead repackage most of your harms as advantages. And now we see why. You want to avoid a solvency deficit in which your solvency evidence isn't powerful enough to solve for all of the harms presented. So just present the harms you are sure you can solve. If you lose harms or solvency, you're likely to lose the entire round because you fail to meet 1 or more burdens of proof. If you lose an advantage, you can still win the round because a plan that has 2 of its 3 advantages still intact by the end of the round is still superior to the status quo. So let's move on to our next solvency term, the solvency mechanism. That's just a fancy way of saying exactly how you are going to solve the problem. So if the problem is too much government surveillance, your solvency mechanism might be to end the use of drones, ban warrantless wiretaps, or end the PRISM program. Each of these is a solvency mechanism that, if implemented, would presumably solve the problem. Although the term solvency mechanism seems simple, there are times when you really aren't sure what it is the affirmative team is trying to do with their plan. For example, let's say the affirmative team requires the government to rethink securitization. That sounds pretty vague. It doesn't have details or specifics that allow the negative team to understand how to implement the plan to solve the problem. Now, why would an affirmative team choose to present a plan that's vague and non-specific? Well, the more specific a plan is, the more exposed it is to specific negative arguments. For example, banning drones is a very specific plan, and the arguments as to why it might not be a good idea are also specific. But a plan like rethinking securitization is harder to argue against because the negative team has a harder time pinning down how the plan solves the problem. It's like trying to pin down a watermelon seed with your thumb. As soon as you think you have it pinned down, it slips out from underneath you. And vague affirmative plans try to do the same thing. The affirmative can just slip out of negative arguments by saying, that's not really what our plan does. Now, I hope I'm not convincing you to run a vague affirmative plan because ultimately that's a bad idea, at least for beginning debaters. If the plan confuses the negative team, it probably also confuses the judge, and judges aren't likely to vote for a plan they don't understand, and they often see the trick being played by the affirmative and vote against it. So a solvency mechanism becomes important for understanding vague or complex affirmatives. And when the negative team asks in cross-examination what the solvency mechanism is, they are asking the affirmative team to explain exactly how their plan solves the problem. As the negative team, don't be afraid to really pin down the solvency mechanism until you understand it. Some debaters are so afraid of looking dumb in the cross-ex that they accept any answer the affirmative gives, even if the answer doesn't make any sense. The problem with this strategy is that while you may have tricked everyone into thinking that you understand everything in cross-examination, your negative speeches make it obvious that you don't understand anything. I promise you that if you are confused by the affirmative plan, the judge is too. So continue asking cross-examination questions until you really do understand the plan, because you'll be doing yourself and the judge a favor. Even more importantly, a lot of affirmative plans are intentionally vague, confusing, or complicated. And this is a trick by the affirmative team to try and either keep you confused throughout the round or delay the light bulb, meaning you don't really understand what this plan does until halfway through the round when it's already too late to run an effective argument. The good news for the negative team is that the more vague, confusing, or complicated these are, the bigger the problems there are with them. And even if it takes you 2 or 3 minutes to wrap your head around the plan in cross-examination, once you do, it's much easier to beat. This is nearly always true. So even if you have to use your every second of cross-examination to understand the solvency mechanism, it's worth it every time. So a good rule to remember is never finish the first cross-ex without understanding exactly what the plan is, does, and doesn't do, even if it takes the entire cross-ex. Okay, so I think we've covered solvency mechanism enough. So let's move on to our next topic, the solvency evidence. And it is by far the most important evidence in the first affirmative constructive. A good affirmative team will never stop searching for better solvency evidence for their case, and a good negative team will never stop analyzing that evidence for flaws. Depending on how the affirmative team chooses to create their first affirmative constructive, the solvency portion of their constructive can have between 1 and 3 pieces of evidence. So I'm going to speak as though there's only one piece of evidence because that's pretty normal. But the strategies we'll talk about should be applied to every piece of solvency evidence in the 1AC. The solvency evidence presented in the first affirmative constructive should identify, ideally, the problem, the harms, and the solvency mechanism to solve the harms. Since researchers and publishers don't write for debate teams, it can be hard to find one paragraph that talks about the same problem, the same harms, and the same solvency mechanism as the 1AC. And that's why solvency evidence sometimes requires 2 or 3 pieces of evidence. Other times, you'll find evidence that covers all 3 in one sentence. As the negative team, you'll want to examine that solvency evidence very, very closely. Does it specifically mention the solvency mechanism, or does it only mention the topic? For example, the evidence that claims curtailing government surveillance increases liberty isn't the same as evidence that claims ending the use of drones increases liberty. In the first example, it only says curtailing surveillance. It doesn't say by how much or in what ways the surveillance should be reduced. So it's not as specific to the affirmative plan. Maybe the authors of that evidence had something completely different in mind when they said curtailing surveillance. Even more likely, one paragraph was cut out from a much longer article, and that article may not have listed ending drones as a recommended strategy. So it becomes really important that the negative team point out any gaps between what the affirmative team claims their evidence says versus what it actually says. Negative teams can make winning arguments just by pointing out what's not in the affirmative solvency evidence. And the affirmative team has the burden to prove that their solvency mechanism will solve the harms and to provide evidence to support it. Moreover, the affirmative team has had weeks or even months to find this evidence. So if the evidence does not clearly mention the problem, the harms, and the specific solvency mechanism, the negative team should latch onto that like a dog on a bone and not let go. Okay. Let's move on to our last and most important solvency concept, the solvency advocate. An advocate is someone who favors, champions, or speaks in favor of an idea or person. And in the debate world, a solvency advocate is the person or institution who wrote the solvency evidence. The solvency advocate is an important concept because it provides expert testimony that a plan will work. Without this expert testimony, all you have is a couple of high school kids who are offering plans to solve major global problems. And the odds that they really understand the problem enough to offer effective solutions are minimal. So bringing in an expert who understands the problem and who does recommend a specific solution adds tremendous credibility to the affirmative team. Finding a solvency advocate doesn't mean you have to go out and physically find someone who can vouch for your affirmative plan. Whoever wrote your solvency evidence automatically becomes your solvency advocate. Remember that solvency evidence is the most important evidence in the round, and the affirmative team must solve the harms they present. Before we go, let's cover the major terms we learned in this video. Solvency, stock issues, burden of proof, solvency deficit, solvency mechanism, solvency advocate. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.